A day before my NDE, I went to see my doctor because I was having problems sitting. When he examined my rectum, he found a very large abscess. I was immediately sent to a surgeon who scheduled me to have an operation the following day. When I was in the outpatient surgery center, they attempted to start me on an intravenous drip, but were having difficulty doing so. My spirit was traveling very fast, and I saw the earth below me, and I seemed to be amidst the stars. Then I heard a thump, and I landed in this very cloudy place, and the people I saw were all dead people whom I, as a nurse, had once cared for. They welcomed me and were all smiling. They parted, and coming towards me was my father, who had died 6 months prior. I remember how happy I was because I loved my dad so much, and he had died. My father smiled at me and held my hand and led me to a tunnel. Then they put a blood pressure cuff on my arm, however it would not register. I walked into the tunnel, and standing in the middle of the tunnel was a figure dressed in white with long hair. His back was to me, and I saw all the good things and all the bad things that I had done in my entire life. Then I heard 3 voices. He said, "You can stay or you can leave." I thought to myself, I can stay or I can leave. I said, "I am not good enough to be here." And the voices said, "Oh, but you are." The voices were so tender, and the thought of staying seemed so pleasing to me, and I wanted to stay with my dad, but I suddenly felt this tugging at my shoulders. It seemed to be pulling at me, and I knew instantly that it was the prayers of my family, my children, and immediately I said, "I gotta go." I felt incredible love coming from this person, and I just knew that if he turned and looked at me, I would be dead. Beyond this man was an incredible place. The colors were interactive and alive. It seemed like a paradise, except the colors were alive, and the rocks and sky and grass and water all seemed to be so very beautiful, and they seemed to all interact with each other. I laughed and told the nurse it must be some malfunction. When the anesthesiologist came in, I had this need to tell him to not let me die. I heard a thump, and I was back in my body. And leaning over me was my doctor, who said, "Anne, why didn't you tell me you were so sick? You had a cardiac arrest, we resuscitated you, and performed your surgery without anesthesia. But you are probably going to die, for you are in septic shock." And I replied, "Oh no, doctor. I was in heaven and I got to come back, so I won't die." I remember he looked at me like I was crazy. I was taken into the operating room, and as they put the monitor on me, I saw the heart rhythm VTAC. Ventricular tachycardia is a fast heart rhythm originating in one of the ventricles of the heart and is a potentially life-threatening arrhythmia. I then looked at the blood pressure monitor and saw my blood pressure was 40 and dropping. The anesthesiologist became very upset and started to run around the room. Then all of a sudden, my spirit left my body, and it felt like I was sucked out of my body like a vacuum. That night, as I was lying in bed, I felt my spirit leave my body, and I could see myself lying on the bed. The experience scared me, so I tried to rouse my husband, but he did not wake. The next day, I was in my bathroom, giving myself enemas in preparation for my rectal surgery, and I noticed blood in the toilet. As I got up, I became very tachycardia. Tachycardia is a heart rate that exceeds the normal range, and very fearful, for I felt like my body was dying. I got very short of breath, and I knew I was going to die. I started to pray, because I didn't want my children to find me dead in the bathroom, and then I felt this sensation come over me, as though if I just let go, I could die, and I felt very much at peace. Even so, I decided I would not give in, and I thought if I lay in the bathtub, I could relax and not get so excited. So I got into the bathtub, and as I was lying there, I felt my spirit, once again, leave my body, and I could see myself sitting in the tub. This again really freaked me out, and I climbed out of the tub because I didn't want my children to find me dead in the tub. I crawled to the phone and called my neighbor and asked her to please come over and help me get dressed. She came over, and I was weak, but I felt okay, so I walked downstairs with her help. Next, my father-in-law came over to take me to have my surgery. My spirit soared out of the hospital and into the universe. I mean, it felt like Star Trek. The tunnel seemed to move slowly back and forth, and when I arrived in front of it, a bright light shone upon me and I felt no pain. And this incredible love that radiated inside of me. I saw my life flash before me like a rapid motion picture movie. In that moment, I shot out of that tunnel and soared through the universe. I was very sick for 6 months and had a total of 5 surgeries, and I got septic many times, but I survived. During the car accident, I can remember feeling and sensing my body rolling with the car. I remember flying through the air and landing softly on the ground. I was met by moving forms that were pure energy. It was such a beautiful, loving place. I remember loving it there and feeling astounded by the love that I was receiving. It stayed there as I recovered. As my health improved, the light faded and became more distant. In fact, I thought it was because I was such an awful person that even God did not want me. I reviewed my life, and I did the judging. I went back to when I was about 2 years old. I know I was given all types of information, but now I don't remember just what it was. But sometimes, I just know things, and I don't know how I know them. It's almost as if I have an additional sense. The whole time I felt like I was watching a movie. After I landed on the ground, I remember thinking that I should scream, so I screamed a slow, calm scream. I remember being in intensive care before the surgery. And a man of the cloth, that's all I know, as there was no face, just a presence, took my hand and told me I would be all right after the surgery. When he took my hand, energy passed from him to me. I could feel it go through my whole body. I wouldn't let go of his hand, so he gently pried my hand off his. The next thing I knew, I was passing through a tunnel towards a very peaceful and beautiful bright light. I had no choice but to return. I didn't want to, and I begged to stay. I was told that I had much to do before I could return. When I came back, there was an angel, a glowing bright light at the foot of my bed. I was very upset that I had to come back. I was about 7 years old when it happened. I woke up feeling as though lead weights were pressing down on my stomach. I told my dad I felt sick to my stomach. A few minutes later, I sat up and vomited a large amount of blood. My dad helped me into the bathroom. It had been dark in my room, so he hadn't realized I'd thrown up blood until I vomited again. At that point, in the bathroom, I passed out. I remember not being worried about falling, probably because my dad was holding me, and I'd never fainted before, so I didn't know what fainting even was. During an upper GI scan, they discovered that my jugular vein was misshapen. She shared something with me. Right after she lit her cigarette, the doctor shouted at her to put it out. She ignored him until a nurse snapped, "Put it out now, or leave. There are oxygen tanks present, and they could ignite." That's when my mom finally put it out. She told me she had felt embarrassed that the doctor yelled at her, and even more embarrassed that she gave in, since she's very strong-willed. The doctor suspected it was due to my sleeping habit. I'd always liked to curl my hand under my chin. He thought that years of gentle pressure from my fingers had caused the vein to bend abnormally too close to my esophagus. I saw everything you just described, exactly how you said it happened. We went on to confirm more details I had seen. She was genuinely scared and shaken by it because we shared the same memory of events. And that memory happened at the same moment the doctor had declared I was dead. Because of that, a small piece of glass I had swallowed ended up nicking my jugular vein as it cut through my throat. Then I remember the nurses trying to get me to drink this grape-flavored stuff for an x-ray, but I kept gagging. They told me I wasn't allowed to throw it up. The nurse had asked, "Do you want it stat?" And the doctor had shouted, "Stat hell. You run and you run fast. She's already dead. But maybe we can bring her back if we get enough blood into her quickly." I tried hard not to, but they kept pouring it down my throat. Eventually, I couldn't fight the nausea anymore and vomited again. Another large amount of blood. I guess that's when they realized my parents hadn't been exaggerating about how much blood I'd lost. They stopped trying to do the x-ray and stopped forcing me to drink the grape stuff. I have a vague memory of the car ride to the hospital. Nurses were running beside me. I briefly regained consciousness and saw a doctor holding one of my arms out on some kind of board, inserting a needle. I turned slightly and saw the same thing happening with my other arm. I think the doctor said something to me, maybe words of encouragement. I remember being rushed down a hallway on a gurney. The next thing I knew, I was floating above myself. Same static, same noise. My first clear memory after that was being back in my body. I woke up enough to know my mom was there. She told me that if I lay quietly, she would read to me. I drifted in and out of sleep. I stayed in the hospital for a week. I could see my parents on the other side of the curtain, sitting by the bed next to mine. My mom was smoking a cigarette, and my dad looked incredibly stressed with his hands folded on his lap. I could vaguely see my own body, but mostly I was focused on watching my parents like a child would. I didn't have a sense of having a body while floating. I could see the scene below, but I couldn't see myself doing the watching. After that, whenever I tried to open my eyes, it felt grainy and loud like when the cable goes out on a TV. In my early 20s, while dealing with an ulcer, I found out more about what had happened. Years later, I told my mom about the out-of-body experience. She also told me that the moment she lit the cigarette was right after the doctor ordered more blood. I said to my mom, that's when I was floating above myself. I was in the hospital with an ectopic pregnancy. I was bleeding internally, and signs of blood poisoning were present. On the way to the operating room, after having an injection to settle me down, I asked for a pastor, but was turned down. But it was all right because I had made up my mind that if I were to die, so be it. On the count of 5, instead of continuing to count, I started to pray the Our Father. I did not finish it because I was drawn into a black and somewhat greasy tunnel. Into your hands I place my life, I said to the Lord. As I floated through the tunnel, I noticed that my abdominal pain was starting to go away. I saw a very bright light at the end of the tunnel. Somebody pulled my hands and I was out of the tunnel. I was back in the operating room, aware of the pain again. I felt like I tried to get up to leave. I noticed the nurses pressing, pumping my chest. I saw myself as the body on the table. Still outside of my body, I tried to pull the nurses away and I was telling them to stop because it hurt. However, they seemed unaware of my doing anything. Then one of them said, "She's breathing, she's back." And as I found myself on the table, I felt and heard myself breathe. I felt nice, and the thought of being dead no longer bothered me. Near the end of the tunnel, I felt I was being pulled faster towards the light. On the operating table, the nurses told me to count from 1 to 10. Go back. Go back. After that, I heard murmuring sounds. It was pitch dark in the tunnel, and I felt like I was floating for a while. I felt nice. I had no more pain, no more worries, and plenty of warmth. My daddy was also there. We were happy to see each other, but there were troubling whispers around. Almost everyone was saying no. There was a bad vibration in the air. Faces of people who had died, some whom I recognized, and some whom I did not, were shouting, "No, go back." At the end of the tunnel, I found myself in the middle of all those people. The bright light had slowly transformed into a figure dressed in a white robe. Everybody became silent as the figure came towards me. The face of the figure was very bright, smiling and calm. I could even feel its warmth. The figure was not very tall, but was of average height and weight, and was neither a man nor a woman. I asked, "Are you God or Jesus?" I received a smiling response. "Evelyn, not yet. Go back. Go back." I said that I wanted to stay with my father, was told with a shaking of the head. "Evelyn. Evelyn, not yet. You have to go back." The other people who were around said, "Ah, oh," and they smiled. I kept insisting on staying, but the figure said firmly, still with a smile, "Evelyn, you have to go back." I felt I was being suctioned back into the tunnel, and the pain started to return. I was 16 years old. I remember walking to the car, but don't recall getting into it. We were driving, about 10 minutes away from our destination, when the accident occurred. Then, total darkness, but not in the sense of a darkness that prevents the eyes from seeing, because we don't need eyes here. Darkness is just a word to describe the void of possibility, lack of limitation, complete wholeness, where there is no need to see. I understand that all is well, and this is all far more real, beautiful, sensical and loving than the material world I had previously thought was life. Blackness for a flash. Quickly there was white light. Sound, hum, rushing, wind-like. It's much faster than I would have guessed from reading others' accounts of a tunnel, but that does describe it. I know that it makes no difference whether I return to my body. This is where I distinguish myself in thought from the natural wholeness. There is a body, and I briefly turn my attention consciously to the noise and activity going on below, where there are people scurrying around in states of extreme turmoil. Slowly, I begin to associate with my body again, and a few hours later, I am again interacting with it. I feel no attachment. Even to my friends in the car, I never even wonder as to the extent of their injuries. I know there is an option, to just go on and not return. When focusing on the question of returning or not, I separate from what I can now describe as natural wholeness or sky-like essence. This is when thinking starts in a language form. I begin to narrow specify limit focus to what can be. It's understood within normal context. There is no value judgment or sense of purpose, and I am not really sure why I decide to return. It is like I already understand on a level that requires no dialogue, so I don't need to go through the process of getting an explanation. This occurs about the time they were putting me in the ambulance. It was years later, after a lot of that silliness, that I calmed down enough to begin to make sense of it all. The initial experience began when I had been released from the hospital after being hit by a car. I was staying at my parents' home so they could care for me. Words of our present knowledge cannot describe or do justice to the light's beauty. I wanted to go to the light very badly. We had company that day, and I had a 3-sided walker I was using. I could also hear my father and husband arguing and my mother panicking and changing her clothes to ride with me in the ambulance to the hospital. Having only 1 pint of blood left in my body by the time I reached the hospital, I had almost bled to death, internally. I was very angry with my God after this experience because I did not understand why I had to come back. Now I am wiser, and know there were and still are things yet for me to do, and when I have finished, I will return to the love of my higher power, my God. I felt no desire or need to return to them. Even though they were in a panic and scared for me, I just knew that all was going to be okay, and that they too would be okay. There was a great sense of peace and relief, as if all worries or responsibilities did not exist or were meaningless. I knew I was with my God, and I did not want to return to my earthly body and family. I looked back at the light once again, and the next moment I was returned to my body. I was tingling all over, similar to how if you lay on your arm too long, and the blood is cut off, and then you straighten it out and it begins to tingle as the blood flows back into it. I felt nauseated and got up to go to the restroom to vomit, but as I stood up, I passed out. This is when I entered a dark area, not so much like a tunnel. It really didn't feel closed in, but more like a big dark space. My husband's father, whom I had never met in waking life, but who had died 3 months after I began dating his son, met me here. I attended his funeral, but never saw or spoke with him. However, he met me on the other side and held my hand. I felt other presences around me but could not distinguish them. At the end of the darkness, like looking outward into the distance, there was what seemed to be a mountain, and behind that mountain was the most outstandingly beautiful light. I don't remember having a discussion with anyone, but I could hear my family trying to get an ambulance to the apartment. The ambulance arrived and took me to the hospital, and surgery was performed for a tubular pregnancy. I was having a surgery, a breast biopsy due to lumps. I was 18 years old and I was pregnant with my first child. I was under local anesthesia, so I was totally conscious and aware of everything that was going on around me. The opening that I came through was large, but at the end of the tunnel, the exit became smaller, and there was a bright light, almost blinding, at the end. She said to go forward because there were much better things in store for me where she was taking me. I agreed and kept moving closer to the end of the tunnel. She told me that I was just imagining things and none of it was true. But that was a difficult thing for me to suppress, because I knew that what I experienced was just as real as she and I were talking that very moment. I can still see it as if it just happened yesterday. I had no sense of sound at all. There were no words uttered. I could read her thoughts, and she could read mine. So we didn't need voices to communicate with each other. I was telling her my name, and she told me that I didn't need a name where I was going, which kind of puzzled me, but I trusted her because she was so nice. As we came closer and closer to the end of the tunnel, I could feel the heat from the light. We looked at each other and smiled. A girl emerged from the light at the end of the tunnel. Everyone made me feel so at home, and I wanted so much to go with them. I was looking forward to it, and I didn't care about my life behind me, because I knew that everyone would be all right with my decision to stay with these nice beings. One of the guys that came to greet me all of a sudden looked at me and told me that I needed to go back because it wasn't time for me to go with them. There was a feeling of sadness that came over me because I didn't want to go back. Then a feeling of confusion and indecision came over me. I was faced with the decision to go back or to stay with them. I knew deep in my heart that I didn't want to go back because I didn't feel the need to. I didn't need anyone or anything back there, but he assured me that they would all be there to greet me when it was time for me to come back. He made it totally clear to me that it was okay for me to go with them, but that he didn't think that it would be a good decision for me too. He also made it very, very clear to me that once I floated out of the tunnel, I couldn't go back. I would be with them forever, which was perfectly okay with me. The girl that came to greet me didn't want me to go, but he gave her a look, which was me to decide. I couldn't really hear his thoughts, but I could see the expression on his face. Everyone was smiling again, and my body floated backwards until I couldn't see them anymore. I was no longer in the tunnel, and it felt as though a suction pulled me back down into my body on the operating table. I awakened with the doctor calling my name. She was waiting for me and was wearing a dress robe. Her robe was as bright as the light at the end of the tunnel. She had no color to her skin. She looked like a light herself, but she had a face and hands. Her robe was covering her feet and legs, so I don't even recollect her having any. She knew that I was afraid, so she reached her hand out to me and consoled me. She let me know that I would be okay, and an immediate sense of calm came over me. This was a calm that I've never experienced before. It was very peaceful. This was to be a simple outpatient surgery, meaning I was to go home after the surgery. Could feel the doctor cutting me and pulling the lumps out of me, as if the local anesthesia was unquite working the way that it should have. The doctor was aware of the discomfort that I was feeling, because he asked me if I could feel him working on me, and I told him yes. I guess he didn't believe that I could feel it because he did nothing about it. Next thing I know, my head started spinning, and I felt a very, very hot sensation come over my entire body, including my toes. Then I couldn't feel my body at all. My life experiences immediately flashed before my eyes, as if I was looking at a movie sped up on fast forward. It was at that moment that I felt my body separate from the one that was on the operating table, and I began floating. All the while, I could hear the doctors and nurses talking. I could hear the doctor say, "Come you guys, we're losing her, we're losing her." And then everything became garbled, and I couldn't understand anything that they were saying. I could just see the doctors and nurses frantically working on me. An immediate sense of fright came over me as I floated upwards towards a huge long tunnel that resembled a party hat on its side. I kept turning around to look down into the operating room, but she told me not to worry about what was behind me. Then 2 guys dressed in the same thing as her approached us and welcomed and greeted me. I had to tell someone this story because I told my mother later on that day what I experienced, and she completely dismissed it and told me that it was all a figment of my imagination and that I must forget about all of that and not tell anyone. I tried to call to the nurse that I was not well. She put a mask over my face and told me to breathe, but I could only get a few breaths in before passing out. I was still in my body, but could hear everything going on around me. The nurse checked my pulse. I could still feel at this point, and then called back the anesthesiologist and obstetrician gynecologist. Finally, I was brought to a room and left by myself to recover. I was very weak, but very glad to see my new daughter, Laura, and have time to bond with her afterwards. The next day I delivered the rest of the placenta in the toilet and showed it to the nurse, who proceeded to get rid of the evidence when she saw it. It was the size of an adult liver and took a while to get it flushed, but she managed. Someone shone a light in my eye. I could not move. I felt my heart race and then stop. It just said that I bled heavily. No indications of all the machinery that I woke up to. I never went back to that hospital and never had another child or used that doctor for anything ever again. Today, I have Mark, my first child, 23 years old, and Laura, 20 years old, and both are healthy and normal. Then I began to float up above my body, and a white light encompassed me. I became allergic to certain foods that I had previously loved. No chicken, dairy, cauliflower, and other loved items. Yet I learned to eat other foods that I had never experienced before or had never liked. Sushi, tofu, and other soy products. I felt no pain, and it was such a relief given what I was going through that I forgot about going anywhere. I just wanted to remain suspended there forever. The emotions that surrounded me felt like nothing I've ever experienced on Earth. It was like love was magnified multiple times, peaceful and secure. I saw some people I didn't recognize. One was a woman dressed in a long brown dress from the 1800s, with her dark hair tied in a bun. She said she would help me go back, because by then I had said, "Dear Lord, please let me go back and take care of my new baby girl. She may need me right now." Suddenly, I was violently sucked back into my body and started to feel pain and pressure in my body. I could feel again. My heart was skipping and beating. I took a breath from the mask that was still over my mouth and nose. I opened my eyes and tried to look into the overhead mirror that was set up for observing the birth. I saw myself, and I looked ashen and gray. My lips were discolored. The nurse kept watching my fingers. I felt very anxious. I had wires and patches all over my chest. Nobody around looked familiar. They had chased my husband out a long time ago when this all started. I felt all alone with nobody to turn to for my questions. "Where's my baby? Is she okay?" I asked anyway, and the nurse nodded and said because of the way I bled. I had reversed the umbilical cord bleeding and had sucked some of it backwards to me instead of the baby. Was that okay for the baby? I never saw any indications that it was a problem. Although she had an outward belly button instead of an innie later on in life. I laid in recovery for a few hours and continued to bleed a little more. I went back to the hospital a couple months later to read the medical reports. Even so, I spent the next 4 years in therapy for anxiety attacks and to help me understand my experience and lessons.